Did you hear what they did to Mark? Fired him like a janitor. He'll never recover from this one. But what they didn't know was that Mark heard everything. They fired him like a janitor. No idea he was the man who built the company from nothing. No idea he was recording every word. What they said in that bathroom would bring the entire empire down. This is the story of a man they erased, a company that hid the truth, and a bathroom recording that exposed it all. Undercover CEO gets fired. The conversation he captured tore the whole company apart. They dragged him out, security flanking him like a criminal. But in his coat pocket, the recorder was still running, playing every word they thought would stay hidden, mocking the workers, laughing at the poor, using slurs like weapons behind closed doors. Within hours, the boardroom erupted. Headlines screamed across the country. Leaked audio destroys multimillion-dollar tech firm. How does a man go from CEO to security escort? From leading the boardroom to leaking the tapes that burned it all down? How did one quiet recording spark the biggest corporate expose of the decade? Before the headlines, before the exposés, the firings, the lawsuits, there was just a kid, invisible to the world, unremarkable to most, unforgettable to history. Mark Dwyer was born in Atlanta, 1976. Raised by the system, moved through 7 foster homes by the time he was 16. He never met his father. He barely remembered his mother. His first computer was a donated library machine. His first coding lesson, copying snippets of HTML from websites and trying to figure out what made the colors change. He didn't have a trust fund. He didn't even have a bedroom. At 19, Mark was sleeping in the back seat of a borrowed Toyota Camry, eating once a day, and wiring Python scripts on a second-hand ThinkPad he bought for $40 and a handshake. He wasn't supposed to make it. Not in this industry. Not in this country. Not in that skin. But he had a gift. One so sharp, it couldn't be denied. He saw code the way composers see notes. Elegant. Rhythmic. Alive. By 23, Mark had developed a predictive scheduling algorithm that saved a logistics company $14 million. And they didn't even pay him. So he built something of his own. NU Delta Systems, a SaaS platform designed to manage and automate large-scale operations, from emergency services to school systems. It didn't look like much in the beginning. A clunky dashboard, a few clean scripts, no marketing team. But it worked, and that was all it needed to do. He went door to door, city by city, county by county, selling the idea of efficiency and building trust in communities that had never trusted tech. Hospitals signed on, universities, eventually, even the Department of Education. By the time he turned 35, NU Delta was valued at over $400 million. By 45, it had crossed the billion mark. And Mark, he'd become the face of Black innovation in Silicon Valley. He gave keynote speeches, funded scholarships, mentored kids who were just like him, forgotten until proven genius. But there was one thing he didn't see coming. The rot from within. As the company scaled, the board expanded. More investors, more suits, more polished smiles, more hands on the wheel, and fewer eyes on the mission. They said he was too idealistic, too emotionally attached, too focused on community, not focused enough on quarterly growth. Slowly, they pushed him out of operations. They called it delegation. They called it strategy. They called it growth. What they didn't call it was what it really was. A takeover. Silent. Legal. Perfectly calculated. They made him chairman. They gave him a bigger office, but took away his keys to the engine. And so Mark watched, as the company he bled for began to shift. Hiring changed. Culture changed. The language changed. From we serve communities to we serve shareholders. From mission-driven to profit-driven. And then to something far worse. They thought he wouldn't notice, that he was too distant, too old school, too replaceable. But Mark Dwyer didn't get this far by being blind. And what they didn't know was that he was about to come closer than ever before, closer than they would have allowed, closer than they would survive. Because success doesn't protect you from betrayal, but it does give you the tools to destroy your enemies. NU Delta had changed. The company that once felt like family now felt like a fortress. Polished on the outside, but crumbling on the inside. Mark Dwyer still walked the halls. His name was still etched into the glass. His face still appeared on investor decks, speaking at global summits, quoted in articles about tech leadership and innovation. But inside the company, he was a ghost. He had spent 2 decades building something that mattered, something that helped people, that changed lives, that gave opportunity to those like him, those who started with nothing. But now, that mission had been swallowed whole by metrics. NU Delta had gone public 3 years earlier, and with each quarter, the board demanded more. More profit, more cuts, more output with less input. Departments that once worked hand in hand now competed like rival corporations. Executives guarded data like currency. There were no more hallway conversations, just locked conference rooms and smiles that didn't reach the eyes. The energy had shifted. What was once passion had become fey. Layoffs came quietly, but often. Security badges deactivated without warning. One day your desk was yours. The next, it belonged to a contractor. Mark watched from the corner office they gave him as a consolation prize. He asked questions, soft ones at first. Why had employee resource groups been disbanded? Why were 2 black women managers dismissed within the same month? Why was the cafeteria being converted into a revenue-generating partnership lounge? The answers were always polished, always rehearsed, always hollow. Chairman Dwyer, we're aligning with new KPIs. We've restructured for scalability. These decisions are backed by data. But what the data didn't show were the whispers. Mark began hearing them in the margins. Employees afraid to speak up. Team leads burning out. Managers joking about keeping problem people out of promotions. The microaggressions became macro. A Latina project manager was told she was too fiery for leadership. An autistic software engineer was mocked behind closed doors. And HR did nothing. He learned of an intern who filed a harassment complaint against a VP and was removed from the program 3 days later. The complaint vanished from the system. Another manager spoke up about a discriminatory vendor contract. She was let go due to performance. Yet her team had just hit a record month. Mark confronted the board. They met him with thin smiles and concerned expressions. Greg Fuller, the new chairman of the audit committee, leaned back in his chair and said, "Mark, we respect your history here, but your emotions are getting in the way of scale." That was the moment he knew. They didn't just want him quiet. They wanted him gone. They gave him more titles, more ceremony, while stripping him of access. No updates on hiring. No say in ethics investigations. No oversight on leadership restructuring. They told him to focus on vision, to be the face, the symbol, the brand. But Mark wasn't a symbol. He was a builder. And what they didn't realize is that the man they'd pushed into the shadows had just started paying attention. He didn't yell. He didn't protest. He just watched and listened and took notes because something inside him knew there was a rot at the core. And if he didn't dig it out himself, it would bury everything he'd ever built. There's a kind of silence that only comes after betrayal. Not the loud kind. Not the kind where doors slam and voices rise. No, the kind that seeps into your bones. The kind that whispers, "They don't see you anymore." Mark Dwyer heard that silence every day. At meetings where his voice no longer mattered. At company events where they introduced him with applause. They made sure his name wasn't on the memo the next morning. They thought they had sidelined him, muted him, made him ornamental, the founder, useful only for legacy press and investor optics. But Mark wasn't built to be watched. He was built to watch. And now, he was going to watch them. Up close. It started simple. He shaved off the salt and pepper beard he'd kept since his early 30s. Swapped out the tailored suit for an old hoodie, sneakers, and a backpack with a cracked zipper. No more polished leather briefcase. No more branded cufflinks or driver waiting out front. Just a rideshare to a contractor orientation office. Under the name Marcus Hill. Marcus had a GED. 3 short-term jobs. No LinkedIn. No presence. Just another face in the system. They placed him on a 3-month temporary contract. Customer service, Tier 1 support. No benefits. No lunch breaks longer than 20 minutes. His badge didn't scan for elevators above floor 3. His desk phone didn't have call-out privileges. His email had a 3-character domain tag, extension, external. To the managers, Marcus Hill was no one. Expendable, forgettable, invisible. They didn't recognize his eyes, didn't hear the restraint in his voice, didn't notice that he was watching everything and recording. In customer support, Mark learned more in 6 weeks than he had in the last 6 quarters. Calls were routed unequally. Customers with black-sounding names were marked Tier 3 escalation risk before even being answered. Employees laughed about it openly. One manager told a trainee, "If the zip code is south of 60th Street, keep the call under 3 minutes. They're just looking for refunds anyway." Microaggressions. No, these were loud, intentional, institutional. He watched a white male rep get promoted after 3 months. He'd misfiled 16 tickets. Meanwhile, a black woman, same department, was passed over after 18 months of perfect audits. The reason? Not quite management material. Mark said nothing. He let the recorder speak. By month 2, he requested to be transferred. Said he had a technical background. Downplayed it. Let them believe he was eager. They moved him to Tier 2 IT support. New floor, new faces. Same rut. Hiring managers used code words in interviews. Culture fit. Needs Polish. Too activist. He sat in on an onboarding call where a hiring director bragged. "We've trimmed the noise. No more token hires. Only performers now." But the Weist came in a closed-door meeting, where he was the only one who wasn't supposed to be listening. The director leaned back, gestured to a new intern list, and said, "You know how it is. We've got enough diversity furniture to satisfy the audits. Time to get back to building actual value." Mark stared straight ahead. Didn't blink. Didn't flinch. He simply hit record, again. It was a rainy Thursday. Break room, 3:27 p.m. 2 employees huddled near the vending machine, joking about the good old days before NU Delta went woke. One of them glanced over at Mark, wearing a fraying hoodie, earbuds in, pretending to scroll through help tickets, and said with a snort, "I bet Mark Dwyer doesn't even know we exist down here." They laughed. A long, hard laugh. And Mark, he smiled. Not in anger, not in pain, but in certainty. Because they were right. He hadn't known. Not fully, not deeply. But now, he knew everything. And everything was about to change. It began with one recording. A manager calling a candidate too urban for the analytics team. Mark saved it, labeled it, bias_001.wav. He didn't know yet how many files he'd collect, but something told him it wouldn't be the last. The next day, in the break room, 2 representatives joked about avoiding ghetto zip codes. He saved that one too, bias_002.wav. By the end of the week, he had 17 files. By the end of the month, nearly 100. Phone recordings, whispers in corridors, Slack screenshots, casual cruelty passed off as culture. He created a folder no one could see. A map of corporate decay, each file meticulously named, time-stamped, cross-referenced with HR policy, the same policy that was being violated daily. One file captured a lunch break conversation between 2 department heads. "You know we save about $1,200 per head by firing single moms before open enrollment." They laughed, loudly. Another, an executive assistant recounting how her boss made her book hotel rooms, separately, for interns he found attractive. And then there was the elevator audio. "Man, if I hear another DEI initiative, I'm gonna puke." Dwyer might have been soft, but at least he kept it quiet. They spoke like the building was theirs. Like no one was listening. Like power had made them untouchable. But someone was listening. Every word, every chuckle, every silence that followed the wrong joke in the wrong room. He bought a watch with a hidden MIC, a pen with a backup drive, a key fob that synced to a secure cloud. No one noticed. No one even looked twice. In one executive meeting, He sat silently as a VP pitched laying off 20% of the customer service team. When asked how that would affect morale, the VP said, if they cared about morale, they'd have real jobs. Click. Save. exec_morale_proposal.mp3. By now, Mark had stopped sleeping. He couldn't eat without thinking of what he'd heard. Couldn't walk past smiling interns without wondering what future they were walking into. Couldn't stop imagining his youngest self. The foster kid who built this place, being laughed at by the very men who now wore its logo. He didn't feel powerful. He felt haunted. This wasn't just a broken company. It was a polished predator, and the world outside had no idea. Then came the Friday that changed everything. He was in the second-floor bathroom, back corner, where the execs usually went after lunch. A place he never should have been. A place they never noticed him in. 2 senior product leads entered. Didn't see his feet behind the stall. Didn't pause their conversation. Man, this place has gone soft, one said. Ever since that whole DEI push, it's like we're not allowed to say anything real. I know, right? The other voice chuckled. Dwyer would have hated this version of NU Delta. A pause. If he were here, he'd be disgusted. A shrug. Good thing he's not. Click. The recorder was already rolling. He sat frozen, not because he was afraid, but because he realized. He was disgusted. He had let this grow. By trusting. By stepping back. By assuming people would do the right thing. They hadn't. And now, it was his to undo. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about responsibility. Because when you build something, truly build it, you're accountable for what it becomes. Mark Dwyer had created NU Delta. Now he was about to dismantle it, one tape at a time. Betrayal never arrives as a stranger. It walks through the front door, wearing a tailored suit, smiling like an ally, and asking for a meeting. Inside NU Delta, the temperature had shifted. Subtle at first, tighter smiles in boardrooms, shorter emails, conversations ending just as Mark entered the room. The company was still his, on paper, but in spirit, it had been hijacked, and now, the hijackers had figured out he was listening. Mark had taken every precaution. Encrypted files, separate accounts, anonymous uploads, devices bought with cash, disposable email chains. But all it takes is one mistake. A cached audio file left too long on a test server. A file name misspelled, attached to the wrong admin request. Someone saw it and sounded the alarm. The whispers turned to war plans. Dwyer's gone rogue. Is collecting dirt. Is putting us all at risk. They didn't ask why. Didn't ask how bad it was. Didn't stop to wonder what might have pushed him to do it. Because when you live inside a machine of your own making, truth becomes a threat, and those who speak it become enemies. Greg Fuller had waited years for this moment. On the surface, a champion of innovation, diversity, progress. Behind closed doors, a corporate tactician with the ethics of a stock ticker. Greg didn't want to compete with Mark. He wanted to erase him. And now he had the perfect narrative. An unstable founder, engaged in unauthorized internal surveillance, disrupting company operations, violating trust. He didn't need proof. Just fair. Just enough boardroom nods to trigger a compliance review. He called an emergency meeting at 6:15 a.m. on a Thursday. By 9 o'clock, the agenda was set. By noon, the decision was made. Mark Dwyer would be removed. Not quietly, not gently, but publicly, cleanly, ruthlessly. They summoned him under the pretense of strategic direction realignment. He knew better, but he showed up anyway. Pressed shirt, no tie, calm hands. The boardroom was full, notebooks open, coffee untouched. 2 security officers standing just behind the glass. Greg stood at the head of the table, papers in hand, tone falsely concerned. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make eye contact. Mark, he began, we've received troubling reports regarding your recent activities inside the organization. Covert recordings, false identification, use of unauthorized surveillance tools. You've compromised employee trust, violated data compliance protocols, and potentially jeopardized stakeholder confidence. Then came the line, the rehearsed phrase that always ends a legacy. Therefore, it is the unanimous recommendation of this board that you step down, effective immediately. No discussion, no room for context, no chance to speak. Just like that, he was out. Mark stood slowly. No words, no resistance. He simply gathered his notebook, looked at no one in particular, and turned toward the door. The security officers didn't touch him, but their presence was the message. He walked past reception, the same lobby where the mayor once gave him a key to the city, where interns once lined up for mentorship sessions, where a bronze plaque still read, "Founded by Mark Dwyer, 2007. Now, no one made eye contact. Phones buzzed. Slack channels exploded. He walked through the doors, the company badge still warm in his pocket, the building behind him gleaming like nothing was wrong. The press release was already live before he crossed the street. NU Delta CEO steps down amid internal conflict. Other headlines followed. Leadership shakeup at NU Delta. Mark Dwyer quietly exits tech giant amid strategy dispute. Sources say tensions have been brewing for months. There were no mentions of the culture he tried to expose. No references to the discrimination, the corruption, the recordings. The board had painted the canvas, and the world simply admired it. Outside, the wind pulled at his collar. His hands were steady. His heart wasn't. Mark didn't feel angry, didn't feel broken. What he felt was ready. They thought they'd shut him up, that this was the end of the story. But it wasn't the end. It was the ignition. Because when they stripped him of his title, they forgot something. Mark Dwyer didn't need a title to expose the truth. He only needed one thing, and it was already uploading. He left the building, smiling. He didn't run, didn't retreat, didn't rant online like so many others would have. Mark Dwyer disappeared. On purpose. For 72 hours, there were no headlines, no tweets, no statements from him, only silence. But beneath that silence, something was moving. He sat alone in a quiet room. Not a studio, not a war room, just a small rental office on the south side of Atlanta. One desk, one chair, and a laptop older than his last two board members combined. In front of him, a flash drive, 64 gigabytes, matte black, unlabeled, untraceable. On it, 47 hours of footage. Raw, unedited, unforgivable. He didn't watch it again. He didn't need to. He had memoized every second. At 10:02 a.m., he sent the first encrypted folder to a journalist at the New York Times, one of the few still digging into corporate accountability. She had emailed him once years ago, asking about NU Delta's hiring stats. Now she'd have a real story. The second upload went to a viral whistleblower account on Twitter, followed by 3 million people, known for taking down dirty non-profits, fake charities, and corporate abusers hiding behind press statements. The third went to a tech ethics watchdog group. Small, underfunded, but fearless. The kind of organization that didn't care how big NU Delta was, only how rotten it had become. 3 files, 3 detonators. The first clip featured a senior vice president in a private Zoom call, mocking a blind employee's emotional support dog. He called it a publicity prop. Laughed. The others joined in. The second, a meeting with HR, where an executive referred to working mothers as insurance drains. He said the company saved thousands by laying them off during family leave. The third, hidden camera footage from a closed-door strategy session. One director said, quote, "We'll hit our bonus target. Just fire the people whose names don't look good on LinkedIn." Every second of it. Crystal clear. Time-stamped. Labeled with job titles, departments, locations. The first post dropped at 10:46 a.m. By 11:15, #NU Delta Leaks was trending in 6 cities. By noon, it was worldwide. Employees began sharing their own stories. Screenshots, emails. One woman posted her termination letter, received the same week she'd reported harassment. Another shared photos of XX drunk at a company retreat, mocking the janitorial staff. NU Delta's press team responded. These clips are taken out of context. We are launching an internal review. We take these allegations seriously. But the world had already seen enough. It wasn't just a bad PR day. It was a corporate reckoning. By 3 p.m., NU Delta's stock began to dip. By 4 o'clock, 3 major investors issued withdrawal notices. By evening, the company's Slack servers were flooded with resignations. The world wanted answers. Mark hadn't spoken yet, but his voice was everywhere. Not in tweets, not in interviews, but in the quiet horror on the faces of men who thought no one had been listening. And this was just the beginning. It didn't start with a press conference. There were no apologies, no heartfelt letters, no CEO scrambling to get ahead of the narrative. Because by the time NU Delta realized what had happened, it was already too late. The footage moved like wildfire. Clips leaked by the minute, each one uglier than the last. An executive mocking an autistic intern. A hiring manager laughing about white-sounding names. A VP joking that it costs less to lay off single mothers than pay for daycare benefits. The audio was raw. No edits. No spin. And the hashtag that carried it all. #NU Delta Leaks. It didn't trend. It erupted. Across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn. Millions watched. Millions commented. Millions shared. People weren't just angry. They were witnessing something. Something too familiar. Too real. Mark's tapes had pulled back the curtain on what so many already knew. That for every Polish company with a diversity tab on their homepage, there was a hidden basement full of rot. By 10 a.m., protests began. First in Atlanta, outside NU Delta's global headquarters. Then in San Francisco. Then in Chicago. Then in D.C. It wasn't just former employees. It was students, activists, tech workers from other companies holding signs that read, "This is your culture. NU Delta is just the beginning. We believe the mission. You betrayed it." Security locked down in trances. Employees were told to work from home. We are not the furniture. Mark was right. Live streams ran for hours. Helicopters circled. Reporters called it the most visible protest of a tech company since the dot-com crash. It wasn't just noise. It was an indictment. Inside NU Delta, the silence turned into chaos. PR teams panicked. Board members disconnected their phones. The internal Slack was a war zone of exit messages and leaked screenshots. By midday, 3 senior executives had resigned. Not voluntarily. They were forced out. Not because they were guilty of the worst, but because they were the most visible. Greg Fuller was still holding on, but the cracks in his carefully crafted mask were beginning to show. Staffers began leaking meeting notes, old emails, HR complaints that were never resolved. Suddenly, NU Delta's entire history was being re-examined. And the headlines, they got sharper. NU Delta's diversity lies. Founder fired for recording what HR ignored. Toxic tech giant faces reckoning after whistleblower leak. The advertisers moved fast. Big partners. Big names. Within 48 hours, over 6 contracts had been pulled. Ad spending was frozen. Recruiting partnerships were cancelled. 3 major universities removed NU Delta from their career pipelines. Their next product launch, scrapped. Their stock plunged 38% in 2 days. Shareholders demanded an emergency call. Investors began pulling out. Insurance providers quietly revised their coverage limits. The company that once claimed to be too stable to fall was now bleeding out. And then came the lawyers. Lawsuits filed in New York, California, Georgia. Class actions from past employees. Whistleblower protections triggered. One suit claimed a pattern of retaliation against black female employees. Another detailed the systematic erasure of harassment claims. Federal agencies began watching. Auditors reached out. The SEC quietly requested documents NU Delta thought would never be seen. Suddenly, every backdoor deal, every buried file, every denied complaint became a question in a courtroom. A week later, The footage hit Capitol Hill. At a Senate hearing on tech workplace discrimination, Mark's audio was played for the entire chamber. The words echoed through marble halls. A boardroom joke about cleansing the org chart. A director mocking disabled hires. An HR head laughing at a harassment report she called whiny drama. You could hear the silence between the lines. One senator leaned forward and asked the question everyone else was afraid to. If this happened at NU Delta, how many others are hiding the same thing? Mark was offered interviews, talk show appearances, a book deal. He turned them all down. He didn't want fame. He wanted the truth out. And it was. He wasn't on camera at the hearings. But his voice was. Not yelling, not preaching, just playing back. The sound of a system finally being heard. The sound of power realizing it wasn't immune. The sound of men finally being held accountable. Not all victories are loud. Some happen in silence. After the flames. After the cameras. After the world has moved on. For Mark Dwyer, victory wasn't about reclaiming a title. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about being proven right. It was about rebuilding what had been broken, what had been stolen, what had always been his to give. Opportunity. But the chants could still be heard inside the Zoom calls. They asked him to testify, not because they needed more headlines, but because his voice now carried the weight of a movement. He walked into the chamber without a lawyer, no entourage, no PR handler, just the man who'd been invisible for too long, now holding the attention of the most powerful people in the country. He sat before a panel of senators, some skeptical, some ashamed. And in that moment, he didn't read a prepared statement. He told a story about growing up in foster care, about building a billion-dollar company from the backseat of a car, about watching it turn into something he no longer recognized, and finally, about choosing to risk everything, just to tell the truth. He didn't cry. He didn't perform. He just looked them in the eyes and said, "You want to fix the system? Start by listening to the people it was designed to ignore." For once, no one interrupted him. Mark didn't waste time. 2 weeks after the hearings, he launched Project Reboot, a radical idea that shook the very foundation of tech gatekeeping. No pitch competitions, no Shark Tank panels, no forced business school speak. Just capital, mentorship, and trust. He put up $10 million of his own money. No strings, no equity, just belief. And the only qualification, you had to be someone the system had overlooked. Young, black, brown, queer, neurodivergent, disabled, formerly incarcerated. If the doors had been closed to you, Project Reboot would build you a new door. He started small. 8 founders, 8 lives, 8 fires ready to burn. Each of them had a story. Each of them had receipts. Each of them had brilliance. There was Camille, who'd been told she wasn't leadership material, now running a VC-backed fintech startup that employed 30 women. Isaac, a black engineer with autism, once pushed out of NU Delta's dev team, now building software that made AI accessible for people with disabilities. Raya, a single mother fired during pregnancy, now leading a logistics company for working-class moms trying to do it all. They weren't just founders. They were proof. Proof that genius isn't rare. It's just rarely nurtured. Mark met with them weekly. No suits. No board tables. Just folding chairs, laptops, and ambition. And every time they launched something new, every time a pitch was accepted or a prototype landed, Mark smiled. Not because he needed credit, but because this was what he'd wanted all along. 6 months later, a moving truck pulled up outside the former NU Delta Tower. The sign came down, letter by letter, symbol by symbol, erased. In its place, a new name, the Reboot Center, a space not for profit, but for possibility. What used to be corner offices were turned into collaboration labs, where black girls coded in peace, where undocumented founders pitched with pride, where wheelchairs rolled across floors designed to welcome, not exclude. There was no VIP section, no executive wing, no HR lobby, just one open floor, and one message carved in steel near the entrance. The future was always here. Word spread fast. Within 3 months, the Reboot Center had over 200 applications. Founders from Baltimore, designers from Oakland, single dads, formerly incarcerated youth, trans developers from the South who had never been welcomed in a tech space. People brought their laptops, their scars, their ideas, and for the first time, they were heard. Not just given a seat at the table, but trusted to build the next one. Mark never reclaimed his old title. He never asked NU Delta to take him back. He never rebranded, never sued, never shouted, because he understood something most powerful men never learn. That legacy isn't what you build for yourself. It's what you build for others. He walked past the headlines, past the podcast invites, past the book deals, and went straight back to work. Not as a CEO, not as a whistleblower, but as a builder again. This time, brick by brick, without a boardroom. And as the next generation of founders stood beneath a building he once created, and now gave back, they didn't just see a man. They saw a future, one that finally, had room for them. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it walks in quietly, carries receipts, and turns the lights on. 4 weeks, Greg Fuller kept his chin up. He smiled on investor calls, assured stakeholders that the worst was behind them. He leaned on the language of survivors. We're evolving. This is a necessary reset. We remain committed to excellence. But inside the walls of NU Delta, something darker was unraveling. It started with a leak. An anonymous folder sent to a group of investigative journalists. Thousands of pages. Unencrypted. Unforgiving. Internal audits. Slack threads. Expense reports. Off-the-record memos. And most damning of all, emails with Greg's digital fingerprint on everyone. He hadn't covered his tracks, because he never thought he'd need to. The emails were casual, cocky, cruel. Cancel the diversity hires, doesn't move the stock. Get rid of her before she files, she's a PR risk. If he's got a disability claim pending, don't renew his contract. One thread between Greg and the CFO discussed ghost vendors, shell companies funneling inflated contracts back into private accounts. Fraud, discrimination, corruption. All done with a corporate grin and the belief that no one important was watching. But now, everyone was watching. Multiple attorney generals opened probes. The SEC launched a formal investigation. The IRS quietly filed to audit NU Delta's last 5 years of financials. Then came the subpoenas, the interviews, the handshakes that no longer arrived. Greg Fuller was suspended indefinitely, then indicted, then blacklisted. His name vanished from LinkedIn. His board seats dissolved. His speaking gigs pulled. The man who once led an empire of silence now faced federal court, surrounded by the voices he once ignored. NU Delta couldn't outrun the damage. Not anymore. Wall Street reclassified them from stable to exposed. Their valuation cratered. One Fortune 100 partner dropped a $40 million deal overnight. Internally, it was chaos. Department heads gone. Talent pipeline dry. Resignation letters stacked like bricks. A company once synonymous with precision, now drowning in its own architecture. By Q2, NU Delta stock had dropped 60%. By Q3, lawsuits outnumbered product launches. And through all of it, Mark Dwyer said nothing. He didn't gloat, didn't post, didn't even speak to the press. Instead, he made one quiet decision, to finish what he started. Not out of revenge, but out of necessity. Because sometimes, the only way to end a system is to own it. Through a cluster of shell companies, anonymous trusts, and offshore investment firms, he began to buy, share by share, silent, methodical, untouchable. One firm bought 3%. Another grabbed 9%. By the time anyone connected the dots, he controlled a supermajority voting bloc. 51.4% to be exact. Controlling interest. The board scrambled to stop the acquisition, but it was legal, perfectly executed, immovable. And then, without warning, Mark filed for a board recall vote. No lawsuits, No lawyers. Just a form, signed by the true owner of NU Delta Systems. The final scene unfolded in the same room where they fired him. Same table, same seats, same smell of cheap cologne and power. But this time, he didn't sit where they told him to. He sat at the head, because he was the table. He didn't raise his voice, didn't deliver a speech. He simply opened a manila folder, pulled out 3 pieces of paper, each one marked, termination effective immediately. He slid them down the table, one by one, to the same men who had voted him out. They didn't argue, didn't beg. They just stared, because they knew he hadn't just outlasted them. He had outmaneuvered them. Mark didn't reinstate himself as CEO. He didn't care for titles anymore. He brought in new leadership, transparent, diverse, grounded, and everyone they had tried to erase, rehired, elevated, empowered. Because this wasn't about restoring a company. It was about dismantling the rot at its roots. And when he finally stood to leave that room, he turned to the remaining directors and said just one thing. You built a company with no conscience. Now it answers to one. Time doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it loops, bringing us back, not to repeat the past, but to rewrite it. Mark Dwyer stood at the edge of a room that once broke him. Only now, it belonged to him. Time doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it loops, bringing us back, not to repeat the past, but to rewrite it. Mark Dwyer stood at the edge of a room that once broke him. Only now, it belonged to him. The silence hit first. Then, the faces. A flash of Greg Fuller smirking across the boardroom table. The click of security boots escorting him out. And in turn whispering, I bet Mark doesn't even know we exist down here. The moment the folder was slid across the desk. The jokes behind closed doors. The board calling him emotional. The woman in HR erasing complaint files like they were trash. Each one, a moment etched in glass. But now, the glass had shattered, and the reflections had reversed. The room was full, but this time, not with suits. It was filled with a new generation. Black engineers, brown designers, women, mothers, neurodivergent coders, the very people they once called noise. Now, they were the company. And at the front of them all, Greg Fuller, still clinging to the only thing he had left. Pride. He stood with arms crossed, hiding behind legal jargon, hoping the room would forget who he'd been. But Mark never forgot. _line. He stepped forward. No papers in hand. No security guards. No shouting. Just truth. He looked Greg in the eye and said, cold, quiet, final. You thought I was invisible, but I was just watching. And with that, he ended it. No debates. No drama. Just 3 words. You're dismissed. At first, the room was silent. Then, a single clap. Then another. And another. Until the entire staff was on their feet, applauding a man who never needed a crown. Just a clear voice and a long memory. And in that final moment, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the same recorder. Old, scuffed, still blinking. The same one from the bathroom stall, from the hallway whispers, from the cafeteria gossip, from the betrayal. He clicked it once. Beep. Still recording. The same way it had always been, from the beginning. Because what they never understood was that Mark had never needed revenge. He needed a record of what was done, of what was said, of what would never happen again. This was no longer just about one man. This was about everyone who'd been erased, ignored, silenced. And now, they were all in the room. He lost the title, but claimed the truth. They tried to erase a man. Instead, he rewrote the rules. They buried him in silence. He answered with evidence. They used shame. He used signal. In a world built to forget, he made sure the world remembered. Not just what he exposed, but what he created after. The boardroom that fired him now bears his imprint. The system that shut him out now answers to his name. And the people they call background noise, they're the ones building the future.